Hi, welcome to this brief presentation about preparing for your first assignment, the review of a subject outline. If you have any questions, these are our aims of the meeting. If you have any questions, please post them to the discussion forum so that everyone can benefit from them. This assignment has a self-assessment component, so I'll first go through my reasons for including that, and then work through the assessment criteria and standards for the review and show examples from past assessments to illustrate how I've applied them. Why self-assessment? The key purpose is to get you to engage with the assessment criteria and standards before you submit, to give you the opportunity to review and improve your work if you wish. It is also a process for developing your judgment about the quality of your work, which is an important role of assessment devised by David Bound in his development of the concept of sustainable assessment. Sustainable assessment is assessment that meets students' current needs and also prepares them for their future as professionals in the workforce who need to be able to judge the quality of their own work. As you'll see from these quotes, self-assessment is a powerful learning approach that I'm modelling in this subject. As a formative process, it could be done earlier in the assessment cycle to give students more opportunity to revise and improve their work. For example, you might get students to self or peer assess an essay plan or a draft assignment. For our review, this is the task description, and this tells you what you need to be doing for the assessment. There are four main components: the subject context, learning outcomes, assessment for learning, and reflection. The review of the learning outcomes and the assessment for learning are the key components in the task, because these are the focus of the learning resources in the subject and the theories and principles that are in the relevant CSU policies that we're developing your understanding of. This is the marking rubric, and I've only highlighted three of the different grades, HD, credit and pass, just for brevity, but I'll be looking, they give you some of the differences at critical points, so I'll be looking at the differences in the standards that are expressed here, and what that means for you in terms of the kind of grade you might be looking to achieve. Right, so the differences between the standards for grading that are expressed in the rubric are based on the quality of your analysis, and at the HD level I'm looking for a detailed and critical analysis of how and why your outline is informed by relevant higher education and CSU principles and policies. At the credit level, it's explaining how it's informed by those same higher education and CSU principles and policies, and at the pass levels you might just show some examples that illustrate those relevant principles and policies. So you'll see here that there's differences in terms of the quality of your analysis, how detailed, how well justified and supported it is by references to theory or to higher education principles and to CSU policies, and also that you're able to support what you're saying with actual examples from your subject outline that show me the same thing as in your analysis. Right, here's some examples from the exemplars that I've put up in the learning module, one at DI level and one at credit level. So in here, this is a discussion of the learning outcomes, and in the DI example, you'll see that it begins by explaining the role of learning outcomes and why they're important for student learning, and provides references to that. It also looks at the verbs that are used. The analysis of their own learning outcomes looks at the verbs that are being used. In this case, the analysis is that they're not very well written, and but it explains why that the verbs being used are verbs such as understand and appreciate, and provides references to explain that these are not that they're not explicit enough in terms of describing to students what they need to be able to do. So therefore it's suggesting how the subject outline might be improved by rewriting those learning outcomes to focus on the application parts of the subject. The second one is also well done, and this may not be in the learning outcomes analysis. There isn't a lot of difference, so this probably isn't the reason why this particular assignment got a credit. Here, this example is presenting the learning outcomes that are being used, the verbs that are being used in the learning outcomes: undertake, present, recognise, explain, and critically evaluate. And it doesn't immediately explain why or whether those verbs are good or not, like the one above. It also talks about the actual content that are expressed in the applications that are expressed in the learning outcomes, which is important. The next section does, so at that stage it's just descriptive, but the next section does provide some analysis, because it talks about the higher levels of understanding using, although it doesn't explicitly say, but using Biggs Solo taxonomy, because it's using the language of that, extended abstract, and so justifying the quality of those learning outcomes in those terms. It's a little bit obscure, the discussion, but one could certainly say the verbs that are described here represent a nice range of different learning or different levels of cognitive thinking, and if this subject, which it presumably is at an undergraduate level, they would be quite well aligned with the AQF and the kind of expectations that you might have there. So I think this is also, a good analysis of learning outcomes, although it could make the principles that it's using for that analysis clearer, but it does bring in a nice critical element at the end by saying the concern isn't with the learning outcomes itself, but whether they can be achieved within the teaching of the subject, and so suggesting that it really needs to both, in this case, to link that perhaps it's the theoretical subject with the clinical side in order to that students would be able to demonstrate the learning outcomes. So it does bring in nice analysis here. Now you can see that for me to be able to judge the quality of the analysis in these examples, it's useful if I can actually see the learning outcomes that you're describing, so they could be included in the text of the report, but since a lot, there is a word limit for the assignment, and a lot of you are concerned about words, providing a list of the learning outcomes in an appendix is something that's very helpful for me in being able to review your work. Also on learning outcomes, looking at how the GLOWs and AQF are expressed within them. The DI identifies the relevant GLOW of academic literacy and explains why that's relevant to this subject and the graduates, but it does not refer to any other GLOWs or explain why they haven't been included in the subject outline. Now, I do want to make it clear that not all of the GLOWs should be represented in every subject, but there could be a bit of an explanation as to why some are or aren't, if you're looking at the level of analysis in terms of the grade that you're, or the standard that you're looking for. The second part does show very good analysis at the level of the AQF and identifies it in relation to, there's three aspects of the AQF, looking at the depth or breadth of knowledge, at the kind of skills, which is similar to the verbs in learning outcomes, and also the application of knowledge and skills, which usually relates to the complexity, the independence of student learning and issues like that. So that shows quite a good analysis of what students are doing and how it relates to the AQF. At the credit example, it shows a different way of approaching this issue. It explains what the CSU Graduate Learning Outcomes, or GLOWs, are, and does that very well, shows a good understanding of the different kinds of GLOWs that could be represented, but it doesn't specifically analyse why these GLOWs are represented in the subject outline and others aren't. Just really discusses, you might say, or explains. In terms of assessment for learning, these are the criteria that I've highlighted that come from Assessment for Learning literature, as well as the CSU Assessment Principles Policy. So I'm looking for a discussion of at least some elements of these, those that might be represented in your subject outline, and ones that might not be, and why that might be so. Here I've started with the credit example. This tends to be descriptive rather than analytical. It states that there is constructive alignment of the assessment tasks to the subject learning outcomes, but doesn't make it clear which tasks are aligned with which learning outcomes, which is something that I am looking for to essentially illustrate that alignment. It describes the range of assessment tasks used, and these seem to reflect good practice in that there is a range of assessment tasks, and also one of them provides early formative feedback, but it doesn't really explain the principles in themselves. They tend to be implicit within that description, so it doesn't either reference them or specifically explain that they are good practice principles and why. But overall, I would say this, even though the analysis might not be there, what's being described to you seems to be quite good practice in assessment, so that's a helpful thing for me, and it's clear that I think the person writing this does know some of those principles, they just haven't made them very clear. The DI example is more explicit about the learning principles that are evident within the subject outline. It describes the assessments, or it gives me a sense of the structure of assessments, that there are 3 assessments and that they have different values. So the one with the lower value is an early, or a kind of early formative assessment task. So it's explicitly using the language of the Assessment for Learning Principles and the CSU policy here, and sort of giving the way it's written suggests more analysis using that kind of framework. It talks about the formative assessment giving students information for feed forward to improve their learning, and also that the lecturer can gain an understanding of how the class is going. So as I say, this provides much stronger rationale for the assessment design than the earlier example. This one also talks about constructive alignment of the assessments with the learning outcomes, and provides more explanation around that in terms of the kinds of things that students need to do. But once again, like the previous one, it hasn't actually told me what those assessment tasks are and made that explicit link between whatever they might be, a project or an analysis of a problem or something that requires students to show evidence of the learning outcomes. It also talks about the assignment assessing both knowledge and skills, and them being about things that students need to do in practice. So once again, though, this would be helped if I had a table of the assessment tasks, so it would be clearer to me what those 3 assessment tasks are, and things like that. It talks about how the assessments might be improved in terms of their design and implementation, and not the assessments themselves, but the way in which they're conducted, and provide some sort of explanation about why that is so. So in that sense, this example is much more analytical than the previous example at credit level. For the self-evaluation, here's the rubric with the same examples, and here the differences in the standards reflect the quality of the reasoning and justification for giving yourself a particular grade, and at the HD level also explaining how and why you've used the marking rubric to guide the development of your report, if indeed you have. So here are some examples. The DI example makes specific links to the assessment criteria, so explains that those sorts of terminology that's used within the marking criteria. I've analysed learning outcomes using educational concepts and references, including constructive alignment, AQF, SOLO, taxonomy and CSU policy. You can see here that the focus with the references is more on the aspects of the learning outcomes rather than the assessment, which I think was reflected in our analysis of the report. I've used examples throughout my review and supported my review with references. So here there's a more detailed explanation of why this person thinks they should be given a particular grade. They would give themselves HD. I felt some aspects of their report didn't provide that detailed and comprehensive analysis, and as I've said, I think more around the analysis of the assessment rather than their learning outcomes, which were pretty well done. You'll see for the credit example, it's only a very brief discussion saying that they've used relevant concepts and principles and given examples. So it hasn't provided that depth of explanation and justification for a particular grade, although I have agreed with them about where their grade level is. So in that sense, they're showing good judgment about the quality of their review. Here's references about primarily here about assessment, which may help, and I hope this this presentation helps you prepare for your assignment. Thanks. Bye.